Paris Catacombs are a huge labyrinth of tunnels under Paris holding the bones of over 6 million people. It is a massive tourist attraction with over 500,000 people visiting annually. There are many documentaries on the various disappearances and mysterious going on down there. But why did the Paris Catacombs exist today as they are? How did they come about? And why are they such a huge hit with tourists? Before we begin, please like and share this video and subscribe to the channel if you want to see more of our stuff. It really helps the channel out and we're very appreciative of that. Now let's talk the Paris Catacombs. Paris in the 18th century was the second largest city in Europe after London, with a population of about 600,000 people. This time was ruled by the kings Louis XIV, XV and XVI, followed by the French Revolution. It was the centre of the Age of Enlightenment, an explosion of philosophic and scientific activity. These movements argued for a society based upon reason rather than faith, for a new civil order based upon natural law, and for science based on experiments and observation. It also saw the construction of many of Paris's most famous and elaborate architectural buildings, the birthplace of high fashion and the modern restaurant culture. But it wasn't all great. In fact, the vast majority of Parisians at the time were part of the working class, and around 150 to 200,000 belonged to the poor class and required charity and parish help to survive. It was these people who were concentrated in the crowded maze of the streets in the centre of the city in impoverished and unsanitary conditions that would become the foot soldiers of the revolution in 1789. The Holy Innocents Cemetery was the oldest and largest cemetery in Paris, having started burials in the medieval times around the 12th century. Under the reign of Philip II, the cemetery was enlarged and surrounded by a 3-metre high wall. In the beginning, each corpse was given its individual grave and tombstone. But then the Black Death hit Paris in 1348 and they had no option. Mass graves it had to be. The dead were buried together in 20-metre deep pits that could hold around 1,500 bodies each. And sadly, during this period, these pits didn't take long to fill. By the 14th century, realising how densely packed the cemetery was becoming, the public orchestrated the construction of carnal houses along the cemetery walls. These were used to dispose of older skeletons and the many bones that were sticking out of the ground. So even then, the public knew this was an issue. And all this time, Paris as a city was expanding and growing around the cemetery. By the early 1700s, inspectors were recording accounts of the difficulties of conducting business in the area due to the unsanitary conditions of the cemetery caused by overuse and incomplete decomposition of bodies. The bodies weren't being buried so much as they were being used to make a corpse lasagna. A layer of bodies, the thinnest layer of dirt, and then more bodies. The area was filthy and it smelled horrible. And this was a time when bacteria still wasn't really understood and bad smells were thought to spread disease. And even though people of this time were used to seeing death, certainly much more than we are today, understandably, they still didn't want to have to put up with the stench of it. Still, the burials kept coming. The walls were heightened, the amount of carnal houses increased, and the corpse lasagna kept getting deeper and deeper. So, why did they keep burying bodies if they had known for centuries that it was a problem? The age-old reason: money. See, back in the day, secular cemeteries weren't really a thing in Europe. Small graveyards attached to churches were the norm. And that's what the Holy Innocents Cemetery was to begin with. But then Paris started to grow. And these were very religious times. People wanted and needed to be buried on consecrated ground. And the church, being the church, made them pay for it. Graveyards were never a free service, and unless you were exceptionally poor, and then you were put into a common pit, which was free, but certainly not dignified at the time. Seeing the disaster that this had become, in the mid-1700s, King Louis XVI put forth not one, but 2 official orders for the Holy Innocents Cemetery to be closed and the matter resolved. But This was a time when the church effectively ruled over all, including the king, and they refused. Though they did offer one compromise, they would increase the burial fee so less people could be buried there. And this really set the people off. They were furious. But they didn't have to wait long for the tides to turn. The spring of 1780 brought forth more rain than Paris usually saw at the time, and the weight of all this water was too much for the cemetery's walls to hold back anymore. One bloke's cellar of his house shared a wall with the cemetery, and that spring it gave way, flooding his cellar with bodies. And we say bodies because at this point the dirt to body ratio was virtually pointless. At the same time, the rain had washed away the topsoil above ground, laying bare bones and decomposing bodies by their thousands. The public was horrified, and the church, seeing that there was no real good way of coming out of this, agreed to close the cemetery when King Louis sent his third and final official order to do so. But they still had a large stinking problem in the middle of their large prospering city. The bodies had to go, but where and how? The underground space that we know today as the catacombs weren't specifically built to house these bones, far from it. Evidence of digging under the land that is now Paris can be found back to Roman times. The land held vast amounts of minerals and limestone, all very useful and lucrative. But underground mining in the area didn't really take off until the late 13th century, when the major Paris work sites were put into place for the building of churches, the Louvre Castle, and the city walls. It was a time of great expansion, and the materials that they needed were just below their feet. This continued for centuries as Paris grew and grew. And then the inevitable happened. In 1774, 300 metres of a busy street, along with all of its houses, shops and taverns, were swallowed by the now not so solid ground. It is truly amazing that more sinkholes didn't open up due to the extent of the mining over the years. To avoid another catastrophe, King Louis XVI ordered the mining cease below the city immediately and appointed the first ever inspector of quarries, who was to explore and map out the potentially dangerous underground quarry system, and then reinforce the underground galleries, pillars and tunnels. King Louis had two very big problems. His city was literally collapsing under its own weight, and its cemeteries were no longer viable. He had to do something, and so he decided to go with the kill two birds with one stone approach, when his inspector of quarries suggested the idea to create an ossuary within the medieval quarries. Keep in mind, the sinkhole occurred in 1774 before going on to be reinforced, and the spring disaster of the Holy Innocents Cemetery occurred in 1780. It wasn't like they could mine the area anymore, and with the tunnels now spanning out over an 8-kilometre squared area, there was a lot of empty space just going to waste down there. And so it was. With the quarries now inspected and strengthened, the site was blessed and consecrated on April 7th, 1786, and the moving of over 2 million bodies began. There is no stealthy way to move 2 million bodies in the middle of a massive city. There just isn't. But the king was aware how upsetting it would be for the public to see. So the workers were under order for the first 2 years to only move the bodies from the cemetery at night. The bones from the carnal houses were removed first, then the remaining bones from the individual tombs. Then the hard work of removing half-decomposed corpses from the common pits began. Those bodies, some of whom had been there for years but still not decomposed due to the sheer lack of oxygen and soil, had been reduced to large deposits of fat, also known as corpse wax or adipocere. And here's the fun part to share with your overly woke relatives. These bodies were boiled to remove any excess flesh, and all the fat was collected and made into candles and soaps and sold to the public knowingly. How's that for recycling and sustainability, Karen? All these bones, covered in black veils, were transported by cart in candlelit processions led by chanting priests and then unceremoniously dumped into 2 quarry wells and then distributed and piled into the galleries by the quarry workers. This went on every night for 15 long months. At this point, while the bones were being sorted into various piles, they were not yet the artwork that we see today. Whether they had planned to do this at the time is unknown, because the French Revolution kicked off in 1789 and all plans kind of went out the window. And can you imagine the influx of bodies that poor cemetery would have had during that time had it not been closed? Well, 10 years later, the French wrapped up their revolution and, with this, amongst many other things, declared that all parish cemeteries within the Paris area were to be closed and all bones moved to the underground quarries as well. So from 1799 until 1814, 4 million more skeletons were moved to the quarries. It was during this time that the bones were arranged in an artful and organised way in order to allow better access for visitors and mourners. Indeed, the quarries first opened for visitors by appointment in 1809, many years before they were completed. The site was consecrated when the move first began in 1786 as the Paris Municipal Ossuary. But the word catacombs started to be used by the Parisians at the time in reference to the Roman catacombs, which had been rediscovered in 1578, which had fascinated the French at the time. Ever since the catacombs opened for visitors, it has been a hit with the French and foreigners alike. So not only had King Louis solved his first 2 major issues, he'd also unknowingly created one of Paris's biggest tourist attractions, which now receives around 500,000 visitors a year. Talk about making lemons into lemonade, eh? So that's the tale of how the Paris Catacombs came to be a tourist attraction that it is today. Have you visited? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. If you found this interesting, please help out our channel by liking, subscribing and sharing. Every little bit helps. Now go talk death.